The Pullman strike of 1894 was a milestone in U.S. history that took place here in Illinois. This strike brought business to a standstill across large parts of the nation until the federal government took unprecedented action to end the strike. President Grover Cleveland ordered federal troops to crush the strike, and dozens were killed in violent clashes in streets of Chicago where the strike was centered. I'm going to highlight if something is unprecedented, that's a big deal. But really, this whole paragraph kind of is the overview of what happened. Okay, so this is our overview. So I'm going to make that comment. And if you have a hard copy, I would just sort of like maybe put a star next to that and write overview in the margin. George Pullman was the founder of the Pullman Palace Car Company, organized just after the Civil War. The company manufactured luxurious railway sleeping cars. Railroads everywhere wanted these cars on their lines. The value of the company doubled in value. Check this out. That's a really fancy looking railroad car. It doesn't look anything like the Green Line, that's for sure. George Pullman worried about the conflict that often existed between labor, the workers, and management, the owners. Many companies had problems with their workers. Pullman thought if he gave workers a decent place to live, notice when you see words like if, okay? So it's like an if-then statement. Pullman thought if he gave workers a decent place to live, then he would get a better class of workers. He would reduce the turnover of workers because, there's that important word, because they were happy about working for Pullman. If he owned the entire town, he could protect his companies from bad influences. So in 1880, the Pullman Company bought 4,000 acres in the town of Hyde Park, which at that time was a separate town near Chicago. And here's a map you can kind of see. Then now this is all Chicago, but back then they were sort of different towns. Pullman built homes for his workers. Now he's going to describe the community, okay? So maybe here in the margin, you can kind of write Pullman in the margin. The community was a beautiful place, especially when compared with Chicago, the filthy industrial giant just to the north. 1/10 of the area of Pullman was occupied by parks. There was a lake for boating and swimming and several athletic fields. Every street was paved and lined with shade trees. The front lawn of every house in town was landscaped by the Pullman Company. Schooling was free through the 8th grade. The only condition being that all students had to be vaccinated against smallpox. Oh, what I would not give for a vaccine. There was a kindergarten for children between the ages of 4 and 6. An evening school offered classes for adults. A library was opened in 1883 with an initial gift of 5,000 books from George Pullman himself. So here's like where you can just put in the margins, you know, that there was like schooling, libraries, healthcare. Well, there's not really healthcare, just a vaccine. Okay. And that it's really like a nice community, right? So maybe just put in the, margin, nice town. Yeah. But there was another side to the town, okay? Here's our big but, okay? We always sort of highlight or underline the word but, okay? There was another side to the town. I guess we should sort of underline the whole thing here. Pullman thought that liquor was bad, so he banned it from the town. He kept his eye on everything. He had informers in every lodge, in every social group. He wanted to know everything that happened and to model his town on the traditional Puritan virtues of thrift and hard work and sobriety. All right, so he's kind of bossing people around a little bit. Many of Pullman's workers came from different traditions. More than half of Pullman's residents were foreign-born. By the time of the strike, 72% were foreign-born, including 23% Scandinavian, 12% British, another 12% German, 10% Dutch, and 5% Irish. Many of them could see no harm in a pint of beer. Many of them wanted to worship in their own faiths, okay? So you might want to just sort of highlight here that we have an immigrant population. Pullman had firm ideas about religion, too. There was only one church building in town, and Pullman owned it. It was available to any religious group, but the rent set on it by Pullman was so high that no congregation in town could afford to pay it. So the church stayed vacant most of the time. So I think a key point to make here is not a lot of religious freedom. This is at a time when religion is pretty important to a lot of people. One worker voiced the bitterness among the people. We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shop, taught in the Pullman school, and when we die, we shall be buried in the Pullman cemetery and go to the Pullman hell. In other words, the workers felt that they had little freedom, little control. That might be a point worth noting in the margin. In 1893, there was a major depression across the United States. Okay, that seems like that's going to be a big deal, all right? It was the biggest depression in U.S. history up to that point. The one in the 1930s would be even bigger. As the Depression took hold, orders for Pullman railroad cars dried up. Okay, so here's sort of like cause and effect. All right, so here's a bit of a problem. So you might want to put like a little C for cause. It's the Depression. And then the effect, what does Pullman do? Pullman responded by laying off workers, reducing hours, and cutting wages. All right, that can't be good if you're a worker in Pullman. Wage rates were cut an average of 25%. Rents that Pullman charged for the nice houses did not decrease. If a Pullman worker went into debt, it was taken from his paycheck. Yet stockholders in the company continued to make money, and the company had a profit of over $2 million in 1894. So there's that word yet that kind of sets you off, right? So here's the thing, right? He's lowering workers' wages because, orders for the train cars are drying up, and yet, the profits are going up. That doesn't quite seem so fair. In May of 1894, 3,000 Pullman workers went on strike. Okay, so here's the strike. Here. Many of the strikers belonged to the American Railway Union, or ARU, founded by Eugene Debs. There he is over here. Debs decided to have his union back up the Pullman workers by refusing to allow any train with a Pullman car to move, except those with mail cars. Debs did not want federal troops to get involved, and he knew if U.S. mail was tampered with, the troops would be there immediately. So he wants to be sort of careful about that, okay? Debs' union announced that if a worker was fired because he refused to move Pullman cars, all the union members would walk off the job. So here's what he's going to do to sort of support the strikers. By June, 50,000 men had quit their jobs. Crowds of people who supported the strike began stopping trains. Soon there was no movement on the rails west of Chicago. In some places, fights broke out. So I'm just going to kind of make a note here that things are like not looking real good for the railroads. In order to break the strike, the railroad needed help from federal troops. But, there's that word, the railroads could only get help from federal troops if the president agreed. I can't really highlight that very well because it's going to screw everything up for me. Yeah, okay, but maybe you want to underline that sentence there. President Grover Cleveland said he would only send in troops if the governor requested them. All right, so they sort of want help, but the governor has to ask. So we have a new governor in Illinois, John P. Altgeld. There he is. He's a German immigrant. Isn't that interesting? He was the one who actually pardons 3 of those men who were convicted in the Haymarket Affair because he was sympathetic to their cause. Here he is. Governor of Illinois was John P. Altgeld. He did not want to request troops because he believed that workers should have the same rights as their bosses. So he's more of a sympathetic, okay? So I'm maybe going to write governor is sympathetic to workers. These ideas made the railroad companies nervous. No wonder, right? The railroad managers started flooding the newspapers with stories that made Debs' American Railroad Union seem like a violent and lawless gang and portrayed Eugene Debs as a radical. Sounds a lot like, what happened in Haymarket. So we make these people seem like they're really radical and violent and bad, and that's going to turn public opinion away from them. They claimed that unrest had always ended in violence and threatened that this strike would be the same. The railroads began sending people to work on railroads as strike breakers or scabs, which are workers who are hired to replace striking workers. The Attorney General of the U.S., Richard Olney, is the guy that we talked about when we looked at the Interstate Commerce Act, supported the railroads because he believed the railroads had the right to do things their way. Okay, so I'm going to highlight here what he believes. Okay, and he says, if the workers disagreed with the treatment they were receiving, they could quit. And he was the one who I said he had worked for a lawyer for the railroad company. Okay, so I'm going to maybe make a comment here that Olney is more pro-business. And on June 29th, 1894, Debs went to Illinois to meet with striking workers. The railroad workers there were angry and began to destroy the yards and burning anything that was flammable. Attorney General Olney, actually, that was not Debs. I meant Olney. I typed that wrong. Attorney General Olney requested President Cleveland to send federal troops into Chicago to break the strike. On July 2nd, 1894, Olney obtained an injunction, which is a court order, saying that the strike was illegal. Okay, so now they're going to say this strike is no good. You can't do this. Bad. Okay, actually, I don't really need a comment there. I just want to highlight it. Railroad companies made two arguments. Okay, so what I usually like to do is I just sort of circle it. I think that's easier than sort of highlighting things. So I just write like two. I would maybe highlight that there's two arguments. And then if you're doing this with like pen or pencil, just sort of circle first and then underline that the strike violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. This is what we just talked about, the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was a law that had been passed to break up monopolies, but now it was being used to break up unions. The second argument was that the strike interfered in the delivery of U.S. mail. Okay, I think this is sort of the more important point here, so I'm just going to highlight that one. When the strikers did not return to work the next day, President Cleveland sent federal troops into Chicago. Okay, this is a big deal, all right? President of the United States is sending troops. This enraged the strikers, and rioters began stopping trains, smashing switches, and again setting fire to anything that would burn. Here's a picture, shows how awful it was. On July 7th, another mob stopped soldiers escorting a train through downtown Chicago area. Many people were killed or wounded from bullets. So this is violence in the streets. This is exactly what they were so worried about with, Haymarket. On July 10th, 1894, Debs and 3 other union leaders were arrested for interfering with U.S. mail. They were released within a few hours, but Debs realized that continuing the strike would be a lost cause because of the federal troops. The Pullman strike was the first time the federal government had ever been used. Oh, here's those words, first time. When something is the first time, that seems like it's probably important. First time the federal government had ever been used to break up a strike. And I would put like maybe little stars or something like that in the margin because that seems like a really big deal. George Pullman's reputation as an employer who took care of his workers, Pullman's reputation as an employer who took care of his workers, I screwed this up. He was now seen as a greedy and intolerant man. In turn, he was offended by his workers' ingratitude. Pullman worried that people would try to steal from him. Shortly before he died in 1897, he requested that his grave be lined in concrete to keep looters from robbing him, which is just, I think, kind of a fascinating story. And you can go check it out. He's buried at Graceland Cemetery, which is on the north side of Chicago at Clark Street and Irving Park. There we go. Thanks for writing along with me.